Ever been doom scrolling on social media and come across those foreign language pronunciation videos? You know the ones, like watch Americans test their knowledge of Irish pronunciation, or hear these Brits try out Scottish sayings. Then in the video, they find a batch of words only a Gaelic speaking person could ever even hope to pronounce correctly, and show them to a group of unsuspecting and underprepared participants. Finally, after several failed and often comical attempts at pronunciation, the host finally unveils the answer, shocking almost everyone in the lineup. Speaking of which, why does Irish and Scottish Gaelic have such unique spelling conventions, with all these extra vowels and seemingly silent letters? And why is Manx written so differently from the other two, even when the words seem clearly related? Greetings to all, and in this video, we'll be discussing my proposition for a unified Gaelic orthography for Irish, Scottish, and Manx Gaelic. Firstly, we'll go over a quick history of the Gaelic languages and peoples, then we'll discuss why such a reform might be necessary, and finally, we'll go over the new orthography itself with some examples at the end. So let's not dilly-dally, as we have a lot to go through. Part 1. History and Background. The Gaels, as they're collectively known, are an ethno-linguistic group spread across Ireland, Scotland, and the Isles, and also further afield in Canada and the US. They speak languages commonly labeled as Gaelic, which all derived from their parent of Old Irish, about 1,000 years ago. The Gaelic family itself forms part of the larger Celtic family, making them cousin relatives to the nearby Brythonic languages like Welsh and Cornish, and, by extension, to the larger Indo-European macro-family of languages, which includes most languages of Europe, Central Asia, and northern India. But how exactly the Gaels arrived in Ireland in the first place is not exactly known. It is theorized, however, that they came as part of the wider Indo-European and later Celtic migrations across Europe at the end of the Bronze Age around 2,500 years ago. As they migrated, these Celts ended up displacing or assimilating the indigenous inhabitants of the islands, and as time passed, they separated from each other, creating the separate Gaelic and Brythonic groups. Unlike their Brythonic neighbors to the east, however, the Gaels were spared the Roman conquests of antiquity, and by the late classical period even had their own native writing system, the Ogham script, used to write Old Irish. By this point, the three modern Gaelic languages of Irish, Scottish, and Manx had not yet fully diverged from one another, so Ireland was mostly unified, at least linguistically speaking. Also, with their conversion to Christianity around the 6th century AD, thanks in part by none other than the great Saint Patrick, many new Latin words and customs entered the language during this period as well. By the early Middle Ages, some Gaelic tribes had migrated northeast into Great Britain, coinciding with the decline of Roman influence in the region. The new kingdoms of Dalriada and the Isles spread Gaelic influence east, where they came into contact with their Brittonic cousins and their soon-to-be greatest rivals, the English. I won't go into too much detail with the hows or whys, but for the purposes of this video, it's sufficient to note that the English slowly but surely spread their influence over the Isles, notably at the expense of the native Celts. First, they pushed the Britons to the hills of Wales and across the Channel to northern France. Then they asserted their dominance over the Gaels, slowly chipping away at their culture and language. Though this process lasted over 1,000 years, and arguably remains ongoing to this day, it certainly left its mark, pushing most Celtic languages to the edge of extinction. Funnily enough, however, the Anglo-Saxon invasions left such an impact on the insular Celts that, even in our modern times, the English people and language are still called Saxon, or something similar in these languages, even though the English themselves stopped using this term commonly well over 1,000 years ago. However, despite this overwhelming English dominance over the Isles for all of these years, the Gaelic languages mostly managed to hold on to their rich written tradition. This tradition is known as the Gaelic script, or Gaelic type, and is still used in one form or another by all the modern Gaelic languages. That is, with the notable exception of Manx. Despite its close linguistic ties with Irish and Scottish, Manx puzzlingly uses a completely different orthography, so what gives? While Irish and Scottish successfully preserved their own variations of the medieval Gaelic script, English's influence on Tiny Manx was early enough and strong enough that an English-style orthography successfully supplanted the traditional Gaelic script on the island, effectively isolating the language from its siblings. This cultural seclusion under English dominance sealed the fate of the language, and, sadly, Manx went extinct on December 27, 1974, with the death of its last native speaker, a fisherman named Ned Madrell. With an orthography that is neither phonemic, traditional, or easily recognizable by any account, it's no wonder that Manx suffered the fate that it did. Which brings us nicely to Part 2. Why a Spelling Reform? With all three of these languages in different stages of undergoing a revival, or being straight up resurrected from the dead, it's important that they have a solid orthographic foundation to build upon. Well, that's easy, you might proclaim. Let's just use the Gaelic type like you said. Well, yes, but actually, well, yes, kind of. But we need to make a few changes first. You see, the original Gaelic type was created with the medieval Irish in mind, and its spelling conventions were actually quite phonemic. That is, words were usually written as they were pronounced. But a lot has happened to these languages over these last 1,000 years, as commonly tends to happen. But also, and more specifically for the purposes of this video, the relationship between the pronunciation and the underlying structure of these languages have become increasingly more complex, meaning that creating a truly phonemic spelling system that also respects the inner workings of the language more difficult. This is why when you see Gaelic words written down using the traditional orthography, the pronunciation seems to rarely match letter for letter spelling, assuming a more basic pronunciation of the alphabet, of course. On the one hand, this allows Gaelic type to do amazing things in terms of unifying disparate dialects and pronunciations with a single spelling. But on the other, it often renders words littered with silent, unintuitive, or seemingly arbitrary letter combinations. Of course, if you already know Irish or Scottish, these spellings usually make perfect and logical sense, and to a certain extent they indeed do. But there's certainly ways to make it at least a little bit more streamlined. As such, the basic guidelines for this reform are pretty simple. Take the traditional and age-tested Gaelic type, give it a few tweaks to make it more aerodynamic, and apply it appropriately to all three languages, while taking into account their major dialects. Now, having said all these things, we can move on to Part 3, the proposed reform. Now let's dive directly into our new unified Gaelic orthography. It is available for Irish, Scottish, and Manx Gaelic, with minor tweaks for each language. It contains a relatively slim 18 Latin letter set, each of whom is named after its OM script equivalent, 10 consonant digraphs, a wealth of vowel combinations, and a few other rules here and there to make sure everything is neat and tidy. Let's first begin with the alphabet's individual letters, then the letter combinations, and finally we'll go over with some examples for each language. So let's get started with the alphabet. Alim, Be, Kol, Dar, E, Fjarn, Gort, Ua, Yoa, Lush, Muny, Nin, On, Pin, Rush, Sal, Chinye, and finally Ur. So those are all of the single letters. No X, Y, Z, or anything like that. Let's then move on to the rules governing these consonant sounds in particular. So as with all modern Celtic languages, that is to say, both the Gaelic and Brythonic groups, Gaelic features a grammatical concept called consonant mutations. The basic gist of it is that, in certain contexts, certain initial letters of a word will spontaneously change in pronunciation to a completely different sound. In this example, we have the word for woman, bian, spontaneously changing its initial B sound to a V sound, an vian, the woman. The rules for when and where mutations like these occur are quite complicated and outside the scope of this video. But all that we need to be aware for that is that this does happen quite frequently, and we need a way to accurately and clearly represent this in our orthography. Additionally, due to the many sound changes that have occurred throughout Gaelic's history, several consonants in the middle of words as well were also lenited, or softened, in addition to at the beginning, changing the pronunciation in a similar fashion. These processes, of course, also occurred in the Brythonic languages, both in initial position and in the middle of words. But despite the surface similarity, however, their ultimate outcomes between the Gaelic and the Brythonic types were different, so we can't quite use the same system that they have in our case. Now, with these things in mind, here are the digraphs we'll be using for these consonant mutations. These are nearly identical to what modern Irish and Scottish use, but how and when these are used will be slightly different. Do note here as well that some of these digraphs do have similar or sometimes even identical pronunciations in their standard forms, such as the BH and MH, and the DH and GH respectively. This is done intentionally, as not every dialect or language pronounces these quite the same way, so merging them into a single spelling isn't really viable or practical. But regardless of their precise pronunciation, however, this is the full table of all mutations and who gets substituted for what and where. The scheme laid out here is pretty straightforward and doesn't require much brain power to make sense of, but essentially, whenever a consonant undergoes a mutation, its letter will be fully replaced with its mutated form, which is what the Brythonic languages, and interestingly enough, Manx, already do. The slight exception here is with the odd words that begin with a vowel, where the mutation gets attached before its corresponding initial vowel instead of outright replacing it, since otherwise it would remove the vowel. Do note that there are no hyphens here or weird capitalization rules. These letters simply get replaced or attached and are capitalized like any other non-mutated word. As we see in this example, the initial B in bad, meaning boat, becomes an M in amad, their boat. As mentioned before, the B is fully replaced by the M, no questions asked. But as some of you may know, this goes against what modern Irish does, which confusingly attaches the M before the B, keeping only the B capitalized if it was already, then making it completely silent. This is now abolished since the mutated letter is fully replaced. Next, we see an example with a vowel initial word, Éireann, meaning Ireland. Here, since the initial E is still pronounced even after the mutation, it is kept, and the N is simply attached before it. In the past, this N would either be hyphenated before the word or attached before it, but it would not be capitalized in either case. Though, to make things even worse, these mutated letters might sometimes even get attached to the preceding word instead, as shown in the note below. Now, neither of these will happen any longer, as those systems are henceforth abolished. No more hyphens, no more floating eclipsed letters, and no more funny business with the capital letters. Just write how it's pronounced, plain and simple. A couple of more things to note with the consonants. Like mentioned before, I was considering merging some of these digraphs into a single one, since they can be pronounced quite similar at times, but I eventually chose against this. This was because I wanted to keep some semblance of historicity and etymology, but also, even really similar digraphs like BH and MH can actually be pronounced differently in certain dialects or situations. As such, these digraphs will remain here and separate. What won't remain as they are, however, are completely silent consonants. Lenited consonants which no longer play any role in any modern dialects, even so much as merely acting as syllable breaks, for example, will simply be deleted, as they are no longer needed. In this example, the DH in Gaelic, meaning Gaelic, serves no purpose other than being etymologically present. It is not pronounced in any major dialect, doesn't change how the previous vowel is pronounced, more on that later, and isn't really used in any noun declension patterns or the like. As such, it will simply be deleted. Words in similar situations should consider how the major dialects of the language pronounce such words, as to ensure that things that are needed aren't deleted needlessly, while things that aren't needed can be safely deleted without suffering too much loss. So that's it for the consonant rules. Now we'll look into the real meat and potatoes in this video, the vowels. Traditionally, Gaelic has the quite frankly common 5-vowel array of a, e, o, u, plus their long variants, a, e, o, u, for a total of 10 vowels. The short vowels will use the traditional Latin equivalent for these, and the long counterparts will use the same with the traditional acute accent over top, called a fada in Gaelic, or long mark. That means no grave accents or other diacritics pointing in different directions. So apologies, Scottish, that's just how things roll. And well, that's it, I guess. That's all the vowels, so we're done. Thanks for watching. Haha, just kidding. Both you and I know there's way more to it than this, as previously alluded to. The problem here is that most of these vowels are no longer actually pronounced at all like this, with many dialects having reshuffled this simple 10-vowel system into something far more complex. Plus the fact that all vowels can both affect and be themselves affected by nearby consonants. As such, to talk more in depth about these vowels, we need to go back to talking about consonants. As depicted in this neatly colored graph, all the Gaelic languages and dialects have a complex system of palatalization, where every consonant, except for H, comes in plain, also called broad, and palatalized, also called slender, pairs. That is to say, for every regular consonant, there is a duplicate one with a very short y sound after it. How this system came about is thanks to a number of sound changes which occurred dating back over 1500 years ago. Simplifying the explanation tremendously, whenever a consonant was near a slender vowel, that is an I or an E, it became palatalized or softened in order to make the pronunciation a little faster or easier. Then, as time went on, certain vowels were reduced or changed around, then oftentimes entirely deleted, leaving the palatalization or slenderness of the vowel behind, despite there no being actual vowel there. This is actually very similar to what happened in the Slavic languages of Eastern Europe. Though each language went about it slightly differently, the fact remains that certain vowels caused palatalization of the preceding consonant. Then, when the shortened or unstressed ones disappeared, it left behind a soft consonant with no vowel after. So, with these things in mind, how is the orthography supposed to deal with these complexities? The answer is both simple yet complicated at the same time, and is summarized in the phrase Kil ye kil, agus leathan le leathan. My poor Gaelic pronunciation aside, it basically means broad with broad and slender with slender. But what does this mean exactly? Basically, we divide the vowels into two camps, one for broad or plain, and the other for slender or palatalizing. Just as in the modern Romance languages where the letters C and G are soft before E and I and hard everywhere else, so too will all the Gaelic consonants be soft in the vicinity of E and I before or after and hard everywhere else. Awesome, that's it then, right? Pack it up and go to town. Well, not quite just yet. The thing is, not only can all consonants be hard or soft pretty much anywhere, but most modern Gaelic dialects usually have more than just the 5 regular vowels, and all of those can also be either hard or soft. So now we'll need to get a little bit more creative in how we deal with them. That's where this table comes in, keeping in mind that the many Gaelic dialects all have diverging pronunciations of the same 5 classical medieval Irish vowels. We'll start with those as a base, then fill out the columns depending on the context they appear in. This way, a whole range of different dialects can all use the same spellings for the same words, unifying these languages across the board. You may have noticed, however, that some spelling options appear to repeat in multiple places. This is again due to the divergence of pronunciation in different dialects, which oftentimes merged or split vowel phonemes depending on their own specific sound changes. As such, vowel spellings, though usually quite regular, might have the odd pronunciation difference depending on the word. Lastly, vowels which have multiple vowel spellings for the same option are dependent on either etymology or word position, thus reducing the number of homographs, words that look the same, and makes understanding what you're reading far more efficient. And though all of this might seem a little complicated at first, it's all usually quite regular and logical. So once you learn the basic rules for the vowels in your respective dialect or language, spelling things out shouldn't be too much of an issue, as there will rarely be exceptions. So having said that, we'll move on to Part 4, Examples. In this last part, we'll be going over some examples of the new orthography in action. However, I do ask, dear viewer, that you might forgive me for any spelling or etymological mistakes in these examples, as finding reliable sources for Manx especially was easier said than done. I did take care to verify things as much as I could, but things might have still slipped through the cracks. That being said, let's start with the Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as this text exists in all languages equally. Also, feel free to pause the video at your leisure, should you wish to read the examples more closely. Starting off with Irish, not too much has changed other than the simplification of the initial mutations and the odd respelling of vowels. This, of course, was the whole point from the beginning, as we discussed earlier in the video, since we don't want to completely throw away the system they already had in place, but just to clean it up a little. Scottish shares a similar story, only seeing minor modifications to a few words and the notable reversal in the direction of the accent marks. Poor old Manx, however, is an entirely different story. It saw the complete overhaul to the spellings of almost every single word. Gone now are the days where it might have been confused for an aberrant dialect of English or Welsh, and now proudly boasts its Gaelic heritage in full display. In this slide, we can see all the old versions side by side, with Irish and Scoting looking somewhat similar, and Manx doing whatever it was doing before. But now, would you look at that? The 3 siblings, one separated at birth, have once again been reunited. Almost brings a tear to your eye. Now for our final example, we'll take a quick look at the popular patriotic hymns of these regions, beginning once again with Ireland. The Soldier Song sees few changes once again, and that was to be expected as previously mentioned. The Flower of Scotland sees a little bit more change, but nothing too major or out of place. Mostly the accents once again changing direction and the simplification of a few vowel clusters. Finally, we have the land of our birth in Manx, and oh boy, I'll let this one speak for itself. I'm not going to lie, trying to decode what was written on the left, then trying to pair it with its Gaelic etymology certainly took some time, so please forgive me if there are any mistakes on this one. Also, I did manage to figure out that there's a couple of English loanwords mixed in here as well, so see if you can find them out. And that's it for today's video. I'll leave you with some nice photos from each region, and hope that you enjoyed this video. I pray this topic will ignite some positive discussion and get people interested in this topic. Feel free to leave a comment on this video with your thoughts, and like the video if you liked it. Oh, and before I forget, remember that name from earlier? Well, here's the new recommended spelling. Not completely different, but certainly a little closer to its common pronunciation. That's all from me for now. See you next time, and thanks so much for watching.